So, Paul, I first experienced Paul when he was on the stage of TEDx Toronto a few years ago. I was blown away by his story. I thought it was just incredible. And I'm going to let him tell you some of that. But he has a background in policing, in hostage negotiation. I had him on my podcast as well, where we really talked about the skills that he learned and used in those jobs to apply it to mental health related context. So that's why I wanted to have him back on the live cast today. He's a great storyteller. So Paul, let's see if I can get you. There you are.
Here we are. How you doing?
Good, Paul. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Looks like my video. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I missed that. We just got a little bit of a lag here, so I apologize if I cut you off or anything like that. I don't intend to.
Okay. No, I was just going to say that your video quality, that's not working, eh?
It's a little choppy. Rudy, why don't you monitor it? We'll continue on, I think, for a few minutes here. If it becomes too distracting, then we'll try to figure out another way to bring you in.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So, Paul, it's probably better to hear from you than from me about who you are. So why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
I came from an abusive background, which had a very violent father, who she used to beat my used to beat my brother, my mother, and myself, and used to lock me in a trunk. I got through childhood fearing, living under the radar, so to speak, trying not to make any noise and trying not to upset, the monster in the house. Mm-hmm. I also felt I was conditioned to believe that I wouldn't amount to anything and that I shouldn't even try because I wasn't succeeding in school. I was fearful at home and I became very depressed at a young age. But something happened to me in grade 7 that changed my entire outlook on things, because when I felt like a failure, I acted like a failure. And in grade 7, I was starting to like girls. I was starting to, to pay attention to them. And this one teacher actually embarrassed me so significantly in class one day. I want and I expect everybody to pass the next test, and everybody will, except for you, Nadeau. I know that you're already going to fail. And that was the moment that really hurt in me. And I went back home and I did something that I had not been accustomed to. I started studying as much as I could for that test. And I went in and I wrote it. And as was customary in the teacher's class, he would call the person with the lowest grade to pick up their paper first. And I was conditioned to be that person. When you start believing you're a failure, you behave like a failure. And so I waited, for my name to be called, and it wasn't that day. And it wasn't for, halfway through the class. And my classmates were wondering, what the heck? And then finally, there were 3 people left in the classroom to be called up to pick up their paper. I was the one to receive the second highest grade. That was a defining moment for me, Mark, because it was then that I realized that I didn't have to listen to those voices in my head that conditioned and programmed me to believe that I was a failure. And the feeling of that walk, it was not a walk of shame that I took to take my paper. It was a walk of pride. And the look in my classmates' eyes and the feeling I had in my heart really evolved into believing in myself to the point where I eventually became a police officer, something that I had promised myself to do. And
I think you had mentioned that. Was it your dad that was a police officer, or there's policing in your family?
No, there was never any policing in my family. Okay. No, in fact, my father was a factory worker.
Okay.
And he killed Santa Claus. I think I told you that during our talk when I was 7 years.
So this is what I'm remembering. I think there was some sort of connection here between why you became a police officer and this desire for maybe law and order. I can't quite remember what it was.
Yeah, no, what it was, Mark, is that because of the abuse that I suffered at home, and his killing Santa Claus. When I say he killed Santa Claus, some of the listeners are probably wondering what. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, and my brother and I were standing inside the home, just by the front door, and we were both excited that Christmas was coming and that Santa Claus was coming. And my father walked in from outside carrying a .22 rifle in his hands. And he looked at both of us dead in the eye, and as serious as could be, said, "I just killed Santa Claus. There won't be a Christmas this year." And then he walked downstairs and put his rifle away.
How old were you guys at this point?
I was 7, and my younger brother was about 5. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I have a 6-year-old right now, and I can't possibly imagine. I mean, what kind of impact that would have on you guys?
I just remember both of us breaking down and crying, uncontrollably. And it was, we believed him.
Sure.
There was no reason not to believe this violent man that was capable of hurting,
Well, and this is something else too, that I think that people, they don't realize that when somebody attacks the thing that is really important to you, it doesn't matter if it's important to anybody else. If you're a 6-year-old kid and you really believe in Santa Claus, and that's the center of that time of year in your whole world, when somebody kills that person and you really believe it, that's traumatic. When somebody kills the things that are important to us, that's what trauma is, I think.
I agree with you. And, you internalize that trauma, and it affects you in many ways. Simply, after experiencing that trauma, I think my father realized he had gone a little bit too far. So he had asked a friend of his about a week later to come to the house wearing a Santa outfit with a stupid mask on. And I just looked at the guy, looked behind his mask, and walked away. Like I knew that he was a fake, and everything else was going to be fake, concerning, Santa Claus and Christmas. But it was things like that made me so determined that when I grew up, I wanted to become a police officer so I could arrest my father and people like him. And that's what motivated me to become a cop. Now, at the age of 17, my father killed himself with the same rifle that he killed Santa Claus with. So I wasn't able to arrest him or seek, some kind of justice on him. But I became that cop, and having that newfound belief in myself, I knew that I wanted to help others, and I really applied myself to my work as a police officer.
Can I ask you, if it's not too personal? I've got kind of a thing for asking personal questions, though.
Yeah, that's okay.
When people die, I think that there's a complicated relationship when it's somebody who has been, when we've had a trauma history with them, when we've had a difficult upbringing with them. And I think people think that you're supposed to love and honor your parents and all this biblical stuff, but when it's been such a traumatic part of your life. So what was your reaction like when your father killed himself? What were you thinking and feeling when you found that out?
Well, I was 17, and my mother and my younger brother and sister were living alone. And I remember visiting with them, hearing the news from the detectives, and not feeling too much sadness at the moment. It wasn't until I went to the visiting, his casket. It was a closed casket. It wasn't until I went there with my brothers and sisters that I put my hands on the closed casket, and it hit me, and I began to cry. So as much as he may have been abusive, I did love the man. He was my dad, and he wasn't always a monster. There was a Jekyll and Hyde in him. It just came out at certain times, but most of the times it would come out with us, and very, very often.
Yeah. I think a lot of people who have found themselves in traumatic relationships, either with a significant other or with a parent of some kind, can relate to exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. You tend, as a boy, I was his favorite. My older brother definitely was not his favorite, but I was my father's favorite. So when you're abused, you tend to cling to the one who abuses you the most, because you are afraid that if you don't show that kind of affection or whatever, that more is going to come down the road,
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Now, can you? I think there might be a little bit of a bridge here to the work that you did much later throughout your policing career, and then getting into terrorist negotiating as well overseas. So, can you talk a bit more about how you took these skills that you learned and these experiences that you had and brought them into your policing, and then later into the relationship building with in really dangerous circumstances, like you talked about at TED?
Well, I certainly can. Sometimes we look at things that happen to us that have hurt us, and we kind of internalize that, and we feel blocked from moving forward with it. We feel shame and guilt and regret or whatever. I choose to look at some of the things that happened to me, not so much as things that happened to me, but things that happened for me. What did I learn from this experience? What good things came out of this? As terrible as being physically and emotionally abused as a child was, the good thing that came out of that is that I learned how to communicate better with people. I devoted myself to a career of helping others. Yeah. And I realized very early on in my career that when I was vulnerable, when I shared my story, that people tended to open up a lot easier to me. And this translated into more confessions from criminals. This translated into more disclosures from victims who had been, assaulted or sexually assaulted.
And how commonly, just to go touch on the criminal piece, did you come across any evidence or disclosures that they too had been traumatized? That they had the dad who threatened to kill.
Yes, that happened quite often. The moment I'd walk in, say, to talk to a murderer and or to talk to a rapist or a child molester or a gang member, whatever, I tell people this: you're not going in to talk to a rapist or a murderer. You're going in to talk to a human being, who may or may not have been accused of the crime. So what we need to do is separate the crime from the individual. And sometimes in conflict, we need to do the same. If somebody has hurt us, we need to separate what they've done from the person they are, because everybody's got a story and there's good in everybody. So when I would walk in, the first thing I would say is that I'm not here to judge you and I'm not here to find you guilty of anything. I just want to find out what happened. And they'd, of course, immediately say, hey, my lawyer told me not to say anything. I'm not talking to you, copper, or they'd use other choice words. And I'd say, that's fine. Listen, let me just sit here and talk to you because I really want to get to know the person you are, because you've been accused of something and I have no idea who you are or what happened or why. And I would really like to find out. And then I would start trying to establish a rapport and, get them talking. And it could be about anything, could be about the weather, could be about, where they grew up, could be about, and then the vulnerability, my vulnerability. I'd start to talk about things that had happened, to me. And it's amazing when you treat people with dignity and respect, when you treat them the way that you want to be treated. And we've all heard that before, but boy, does it ever work. Yeah. When you do that, their body language shifts, they open up. And when you touch on the fact that, hey, I can understand what you might be going through, but I'd like to hear from you. I remember one guy, and I'm shifting into one particular example, a biker. Picture this 250, 300-pound biker sitting in a small chair, waiting to be interrogated. I walk in and I begin to deliver, like this: I'm not here to treat to find you guilty of anything. I'm here to treat you with dignity and respect. I'd really like to get to. Within 2 or 3 minutes, this biker starts crying, and he looks up at me and he says, "You were the first one to tell me that you were going to treat me with dignity and respect. I've never heard that before." He cried and he opened up and he told me everything. Yeah. It works when you connect with another human being.
Did you ever find in the course of these conversations, or maybe you had done a lot of the processing of your own stuff through training, or maybe not, I don't know. I mean, you see examples where police officers clearly haven't done enough work on themselves before they get into the field. But did you ever find yourself triggered by any of the stuff that you were hearing, or stuff that other people were going to, really difficult for you to hold emotionally?
No, Not triggered. I wouldn't be triggered by what other people said. I had come.
Or even then just the weight of carrying, because you see some pretty rough stuff, right?
Oh yeah. And that's an excellent question, Mark, because yeah, the weight of it would take its toll. You know, hearing stories of people who've been physically and sexually abused, hearing stories, just horrific stories. I remember working in the sexual assault unit, and dealing with abused children, and I had two young daughters, very young daughters. And, hearing the stories of young girls who had been sexually molested and going back home and looking at my girls and just giving them a great big hug and thinking, God, this world is just so horrific and so many people have to go through so much. And yeah, it was tough sometimes, I remember the murder scene of a young girl by the name of Christine Jessup. It happened in Ontario. Back in the 90s, and seeing, her body that was discovered in a field, and how she was dressed, and knowing exactly what happened to this 9-year-old precious child, and going back home, this was New Year's Eve, and going back home and just kind of crying, it's like, my God, how do you handle this, Yeah.
Well, so how do you handle it? I mean, we know that first responders of all kinds, whether or not they're police, fire, paramedic, or the many, many other kinds of first responder, we know that they have very high rates of depression, of anxiety, of suicide. So what kind of supports did you get from your employer, and how did you manage these emotions? How did it not overcome you?
Well, back, for many, many years when I first started out, we didn't have a support system in place. My support was probably a bottle of tequila, a couple of beers, going out and doing something, just trying to get my mind off it, partying too much, doing whatever. To take the focus off, what's really going on, and just refocus on the fact of what job you have. Right. But over the years, police departments and paramedics and everyone else realize that once a critical incident happens, there is a responsibility to send in a peer group of supporters to bring everybody who's been involved in that particular traumatic experience together so that they can share their feelings, and also to give them information about what they might expect. So, for example, anybody involved in a vehicle collision that ended up in death, or a murder, going to a murder scene. Afterwards, it was mandatory, and it is today, to get together, sit there, have counselors come in, explain to you, okay, in the next 24 hours, you might experience no sleep, this and anxiety, depression, or whatever. And, these are steps to take, or whatever. There is help that's available to you. And, also to get everybody to open up about their experience. This is what we're talking about. My God, the power of having people open up and saying, how are you feeling? Tell me how you're feeling, because everybody in the room is feeling the same thing. But so many people are afraid of opening up and saying, I feel, I don't know, I feel uncertain. I feel scared. I feel broken. I feel terrified. I'm feeling sick. And every, 2 or 3 people in that room might say, I'm feeling the same way. But we have to encourage people to do that, right?
We do. And I think, that's why days like Bell Let's Talk are so helpful and so useful, that, nothing is perfect. Right before you came on, Rudy and I were talking a little bit about some of the criticism about things like this, and how, you can't do everything perfectly all the time. But I think having the ability to have a day-long platform, sure, it should be every day, but an intense day like this, to really tell people that not only is it acceptable to open up, that it's actually a good thing, that it can be your strength, that you become then part of that community of peers, by realizing that actually maybe people aren't as judgmental as they are in my head about my experience. There's always some judgmental trolls out there, but the vast majority of people, in my experience, have been supportive because they've been there too.
I don't think anybody has gone through life not being, not having faced adversity, despair, depression, anxiety. I mentioned earlier that vulnerability, people, think that vulnerability, they attach a dark emotion to it. They attach regret, shame, guilt, all this stuff, all this has happened to me. Yet it's by being vulnerable that we connect the best to human beings, because we are more similar than we are different. When we share our experiences, share what we've been through, or share what we're going through, it opens the pathway to emotions such as acceptance, love, understanding. It is the gateway to connection. And we have to, as you said, we have to encourage people to be more open about what they're going through, what they've experienced. Once that release happens and you tell a number of people, one person, two people, a crowd of people, hey, this is how I'm feeling, you'll get applauded for it. You'll get applauded. I was at an event last night, and this is exactly what was happening. People were getting up and telling their stories, and it was just overwhelming, the support from the audience that applauded them. And you could see on their faces just how affected in a beautiful way they were, to know that they weren't alone and that people had their backs, because we are more similar than we are different.
We absolutely are. Well, Paul, I don't think we're going to have to get time. We're not going to have time to get into the other major chunk of your career and everything that you've been doing since. But I hope that if people get an opportunity to see you speak live, because you're such a great storyteller, pick up your book. I see a copy of it over your shoulder there. I've got a copy on my shoulder. So take control of your life. Where else can people find you?
Just by Googling me, Paul Nadeau, or J Paul Nadeau. They can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and on the internet. Reach out to me, and I'm making a difference in the world, and I want to continue doing that, and I want to continue supporting people and encouraging people to be more vulnerable, to open up, and to make this world a happier place.
Thanks so much for joining me today, Paul.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, that's J Paul Nadeau, if you're looking for the name on his book. And he's just such a really interesting person, like I say, to talk to. His story that we didn't really get a chance to get into here, you can go check it out on his TED Talk, My Life Was Saved by a Terrorist. The title is as captivating as the talk itself is, and I really recommend going to see that, because it pulls on the same themes that he was already talking about finding humanity in anybody. And really, isn't that the project of all of mental health advocacy in many ways?